The first sound was a lie. It came on the wind, a high, thin hum that felt more like a vibration in the teeth than a noise in the ear. Most people in the small, dusty settlement of Redemption didn't hear it at all, their senses blunted by the drone of a sun that had forgotten how to be gentle. They mistook it for the whisper of heat rising off the baked earth, or the blood singing in their own heads from too little water and too much worry. But Lynn heard it. She felt it resonate in the handle of the shovel, a faint tremor that traveled up the wood and into the bones of her arms. It was the sound of distant wings, millions of them. She straightened her back, the motion slow and deliberate, a single figure etched against a bleached blue sky. The sun beat down on the wide straw hat that hid her face, its brim casting a small circle of personal twilight. Before her, the earth was a wound she had opened herself, a deep, round mouth plunging into the dry ground. Beside it sat a heavy, flat stone, like a lid for a giant's pot. A simple pulley rig, fashioned from scavenged rope and the axle of a broken wagon wheel, stood over the hole. Day after day, this was her labor. Descend into the cool dark, fill a bucket with clay and rock, and haul it to the surface. To her neighbors, watching from the porches of their clapboard houses, she was a spectacle of grief-driven madness. The Chinese widow, digging for water where the diviner swore there was none. They called it the widow's folly. They had watched her husband waste away the previous summer, his lungs filling with dust until he was more ghost than man. Now they watched her carve a second grave, wider and deeper than the first. The mockery had been loud at first, then it became a kind of sport. Abram, a man whose laughter was like rocks in a barrel, would call out, "Found your way to China yet, little lady?" Her silence only fueled their certainty. They saw a frail woman engaged in a man's work for a fool's reason, and it made them feel secure in their own good sense. But Lynn's labor wasn't born of madness. It was an act of brutal memory, a covenant with the earth. She ignored their calls, their pity, their scorn. Her focus was on the rhythm, the scrape of the spade, the creak of the rope, the thud of the bucket. Each bucket load was a word in a long prayer, a prayer for a future they couldn't see. The hum in the air grew a fraction louder, a string on a celestial instrument being tightened one turn at a time. It meant the spring was a lie. It meant the green shoots in their fields were a false promise. It meant that hunger was coming, and it would fly on a million tiny, clicking wings. She placed a hand on the great stone slab, its surface warm from the sun, and felt the deep, answering quiet of the earth beneath. They thought she was digging a well. She was building a vault. She descended the rope ladder into the earth's cool throat, the world of blinding sun and mocking voices shrinking to a perfect circle of blue above. Down here, the air was different. It smelled of damp soil, of mycelium, of life held in secret. A single lantern cast a golden, trembling light, revealing not a well shaft, but the beginning of a long, arched tunnel shored up with scavenged timber and meticulous stonework. This was her Dixia, her cellar, her sanctuary. But it was more than that. The tunnel opened into a cavern she had carved from the dense clay, a hidden world where the rules of the surface did not apply. Rows of shallow troughs, filled with dark, nutrient-rich soil she had mixed herself, held neat lines of sprouting vegetables, potatoes, carrots, hardy greens, their leaves a vibrant, impossible green in the lamplight. In a deeper section, a small, experimental plot of wheat was already a few inches high. It was a place of impossible, defiant life, and it was a place built from a story, a compact, heavy block of memory that she carried always. Way had told it to her on a night when his cough was bad, his breath a shallow rasp. He spoke of his grandfather's village, of a summer when the sky turned black, not with clouds, but with locusts, a living storm that descended and devoured everything, the fields, the leaves on the trees, the leather on the saddles. When it was over, the world was a brown husk, but his family had survived, because his grandfather had a deep root cellar, a place where he stored not just grain, but where he grew things in the dark. "The earth remembers," Way had whispered, his hand cool on hers. "The sky can be a liar, but the earth protects what you give it." That was her inheritance, not the dusty, useless plot of land, but the story, the knowledge that preparation was a form of love, the belief that you could build a future out of sight, safe from the hungry sky. Above, the scarcity was beginning to bite. The spring rains had been a ghost, a few teasing drops that only served to turn the dust to paste before the sun baked it hard again. The town's communal fields were withering. The corn was stunted and yellow. The creek was a ribbon of mud. The faces of her neighbors grew tight, their laughter gone, replaced by the low murmur of complaint and the sharp edge of fear. Their mockery of her digging softened into a resentful silence. The folly didn't seem so funny when their own wells were starting to bring up more silt than water. The first knock was soft, hesitant, a sound so unfamiliar at her door that Lynn paused, a bowl of water in her hands, and simply listened. It came again, a delicate tapping of knuckles on dry wood. She opened the door a crack. It was Martha, a woman with tired eyes and two small children who always seemed to be hiding behind her skirts. Today, they weren't hiding. They stood beside her, their faces pale, their gazes fixed on the ground. Martha wouldn't meet her eyes. Her hands twisted the fabric of her apron. "Mrs. Y," she began, her voice thin. "Lynn." The name felt strange on the woman's tongue. My boy, Sam, he's got a fever. And my girl, there's just not much." She didn't have to finish. Lynn could see the truth in the hollows of her cheeks. She could smell the desperation, a scent as real and sharp as burnt grain. This was not the prideful judgment that usually came her way. This was need, stripped bare. Without a word, Lynn closed the door, leaving the woman standing on the sun-bleached stoop. She could hear Martha's sharp intake of breath, the sound of hope being crushed. But Lynn returned a moment later, holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She pressed it into Martha's hands. Inside were 6 potatoes, still coated in cool earth, and a thick bunch of dark green chard. Martha stared at the offering as if it were a miracle. "Where?" she started, but Lynn just gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. She sought no gratitude, offered no explanation. She simply closed the door again, the transaction complete. The gift was an act of mercy, but the silence was a warning. Word traveled on the hot, dry wind. The mystery of the widow's food was a more potent currency than gossip about her folly. A few days later, the knock was harder, more assured. It was Abram, the man whose laughter had always been the loudest. He didn't have the grace to look ashamed. He stood on her porch with his arms crossed, his belly pushing against his shirt. He framed his request not as a plea, but as a transaction between equals. "Heard you came into a bit of a surplus," he said, a lazy smile not reaching his eyes. "In times like these, good neighbors ought to help each other out. We're all in this together, after all." The "we" did not include her. She had never been part of his "we." He was a man who believed the world owed him, and her small store of fortune was simply a debt he had come to collect. Lynn looked at him, her expression unreadable. She saw the soft greed in his eyes, the entitlement that mistook her quiet for weakness. She disappeared inside and returned with 3 potatoes, small ones. She placed them in his waiting hand. He looked down at the meager offering, then back at her. His smile soured. "That's it?" She met his gaze and held it. "That is what I can spare for a neighbor." The emphasis was subtle, but clear. He grunted, a sound of frustrated pride, and turned away, without a word of thanks. The line had been drawn. Mercy was for the desperate. For the proud, there would only be accounting. The thin blanket of gratitude wore through in less than a week. It was too small to cover the growing chill of fear and envy that was settling over redemption. A gift of 3 potatoes was not a kindness. It was an insult. A bundle of greens was not a miracle. It was proof of hoarding. The whispers started again, but this time they were not laced with pitying mockery. They had a harder, sharper edge. How did the outsider have food when the fields of good, God-fearing folk were turning to dust? The question hung in the air, as thick and oppressive as the constant high-pitched hum of the unseen insects. It wasn't right. It wasn't natural. The community, a loose collection of families bound by shared hardship, began to tighten into a fist. Their suspicion needed a story to make sense of the world, and they wove one from threads of resentment and fear. They said she had a curse on her land, a dark pact made with foreign gods that leached the life from their soil to feed her own. They said the hole she dug wasn't a well, but a pit, a place she made sacrifices. The story grew, fed by every glimpse of her solitary labor, by every refusal to explain herself. Her competence was reframed as cunning. Her silence was proof of guilt. The shift was visible in a dozen small ways. When she walked the dusty path to the mercantile for salt or oil, conversations would cease. Heads would turn. Eyes that once held a kind of dismissive amusement now held something colder, a flat, assessing stare. Abram would spit on the ground as she passed. Martha would hurry her children inside, unable to meet her gaze. The shame of her need now curdled into a kind of fearful resentment. The food Lynn had given her had saved her children from a night of hunger, but it had also marked her, tying her to the witch widow in a way that made her a target of the same suspicion. The knocks on her door changed. They were no longer the soft taps of need or the hard raps of demand. Now there was a calculated pause before the knock, a silence where she could feel herself being watched from the road. The man who now stood on the horizon of her property most evenings was Corbett. He owned the mercantile, held the note on half the homesteads, and served as the town's unofficial leader. He was a man who understood power, and he never wasted a movement or a word. He would just stand there, hands in his pockets, watching her little cabin as dusk fell, his silhouette a dark promise against the bruised purple sky. He wasn't judging her folly. He was measuring her defenses. He was calculating the cost of what she had and how easily it might be taken. The boy came at twilight, a small fleeting shadow slipping through the tall, dry grass that bordered Lynn's property. His name was Tom, and he was Abram's youngest son, a skinny, watchful child who had never joined in the taunts against her. He moved with a furtive quickness born of fear and hunger, his eyes darting towards the cabin, then back towards the town. He was a scout sent into enemy territory, and the shame of it made his movements jerky and loud. He tripped on a loose rock, the clatter echoing in the immense quiet of the evening. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. He waited. When no sound came from the cabin, he crept forward, his destination the heavy stone slab by the pulley rig. His father's instructions had been simple. See what she's hiding in that hole. Don't come back empty-handed. He reached the stone and put his small hands on its edge, trying to find purchase, to move it even an inch. It was useless. The stone was a tombstone, heavy and absolute. He was so focused on his task, on the rough texture of the stone under his fingers, that he didn't hear her approach. She moved like smoke. One moment he was alone, and the next she was standing right behind him. He didn't scream. The sound was trapped in his lungs, a hard knot of terror. He squeezed his eyes shut, expecting a blow, a sharp word, the rough hand of justice he knew he deserved. Instead, there was only silence. He risked a glance. Lynn was not looking at him with anger. Her dark, observant eyes were fixed on his worn-out shoes, the soles separating from the leather, and the way his thin shirt hung on his bony shoulders. She saw not a thief, but a weapon, a small, sad tool sent to do a man's cowardly work. She held out her hand. In her palm was a potato, baked and still warm, its skin split open to reveal a soft, steaming interior. The smell of it made his stomach clench with a pain that was sharper than his fear. He stared at her, then at the potato, his mind unable to bridge the gap between his crime and her offering. "Take it," she said. Her voice was low and held no accusation. He took it, his fingers trembling. "Tell him," she continued, her gaze lifting to a point beyond him, towards the town. "Tell him there is nothing for him here." The message was clear. It wasn't for the boy. Later that night, a different knock came. It was Corbett. He stood on her porch, lantern light carving deep shadows into his face. His voice was smooth, like oil poured on troubled water. "Evening, ma'am. A few of the townsfolk are getting concerned, worried about you out here, alone." He smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "They feel a body ought to share the burden of a dry season. It seems only fair that what little there is should be distributed for the good of all." He was reframing theft as community spirit, coercion as a helping hand. Lynn stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the darkness of her cabin. She did not open the door further. "This is my land," she said, her voice steady and cold as stone. "My burden." She met his gaze, unflinching. "Stay off it." With that, she closed the door, the latch clicking into place with a sound of finality. The pressure was building. The siege had begun. The boy, Tom, came back 2 days later. He did not knock. He simply appeared at the edge of the cleared dirt patch where she worked, a small, unmoving figure against the vast, unforgiving landscape. He stood there for a long time, watching her haul buckets of earth from the hole, his presence a silent question. Lynn did not acknowledge him at first. She continued her rhythm of labor, the creak and scrape and thud of her work a steady heartbeat in the oppressive silence. She was testing his resolve, seeing if this was a fleeting pang of hunger or something more substantial. He did not move. When the sun was high and brutal, she finally straightened and looked at him. His face was smudged with dirt, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He looked thinner than he had 2 days ago. "I told you there is nothing for your father here," she said, her voice flat. He shook his head, a small, violent motion. "Not for him. For me." He took a hesitant step forward. "I'll work. I'll haul the buckets. I can do things." It was the plea of a child trying to bargain with the language of a man, and the disconnect was heartbreaking. Lynn studied him for a long moment, her gaze taking in every detail of his desperate pride. She saw the shame of his father's cowardice warring with the simple, animal need for food. She saw a flicker of something else, too, the shame of having been caught, but also the strange, anchoring memory of the mercy he'd been shown when he expected punishment. He was a moral test, standing right there on her land. To turn him away was to embrace the same hard-hearted logic as the rest of the town. To take him in was a risk, an invitation for more trouble. She made her decision with a quiet finality that was her signature. She gestured with her chin toward a second bucket lying near the hole. "The bucket is heavy," she said. It wasn't a question or a warning. It was a statement of fact, a condition. Tom's face, a mask of tense anxiety, broke with a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. He scrambled forward, grabbed the bucket, and followed her down the ladder into the cool, lantern-lit dark. The work was brutal for a boy his size, but he did not complain. He hauled, and he sweated, and he learned the rhythm of her world. In the evening she would give him a meal, a bowl of vegetable stew, a piece of flatbread cooked on a hot stone. They ate in silence, the only sound the scrape of spoons against their bowls. He became her shadow, her extra pair of hands, and on the surface he became her eyes and ears, a pariah by association. The other children shunned him. His father, Abram, called him a traitor, the word a slap in the quiet of their cramped, hungry home. But the boy kept coming back, because in the deep, quiet earth of the widow's sanctuary he found something more than food. He found a world that made sense, where labor had a direct and visible reward, and where a person's worth was measured not by their words, but by the steadiness of their hands. The confrontation, when it came, was as quiet and deadly as a snake in the dust. Corbett returned, not alone this time. Abram and another grim-faced man, Luke, stood a few paces behind him, their presence a form of punctuation to his words. They didn't stand on her porch. They stopped at the edge of her property line, a symbolic declaration that they no longer recognized her claim to it. Lynn came out of the cabin, wiping her hands on an apron. Tom, who had been sorting seeds, retreated into the shadows of the doorway behind her, a small ghost witness to the proceedings. Corbett smiled his thin, bloodless smile. "Lynn," he said, the use of her first name an act of false intimacy, a claim of authority he hadn't earned. "We've come to a decision. As a community—" He paused, letting the weight of the words settle in the hot, still air. "It's been decided that for the safety and stability of all, any private food stores must be contributed to a central reserve, to be managed by me, of course, for fair and equitable distribution." It was a declaration of war disguised as a town ordinance, theft wrapped in the flag of the common good. Abram shifted his weight, his hand resting on the handle of a large hammer tucked into his belt. The threat was no longer veiled. Lynn's gaze didn't flicker from Corbett's face. She ignored the other two men completely, denying them the satisfaction of her fear. "There is no community," she said, her voice low, but carrying with absolute clarity. "There are only hungry families, and men who use that hunger to steal." Corbett's smile tightened. "That's a cynical way to look at it. I see it as insurance, a way to prevent unfortunate events. A fire can start so easily in a dry season. A stray spark, a lost lantern, a cabin like this, all alone out here. It would be a tragedy to lose everything." The words hung there, shimmering with menace. He was offering her a choice between organized plunder and chaotic destruction. He believed it was no choice at all. Lynn took a slow step forward, out of the shadow of the cabin and into the full, harsh light of the sun. She looked smaller, more fragile than ever, but her voice was like forged iron. "My husband is buried on this land," she said. "His bones are in this earth. The food I grow comes from the same ground. You're not just asking for my harvest. You are asking for a piece of his grave. I will not give it to you." She then turned her eyes to Abram for the first time. "Your son works hard. You should be proud." The statement was a blade, perfectly aimed, cutting him with the truth of his own failure as a father. Abram flinched as if struck. Corbett's face went hard. The polite mask had shattered. "You have until tomorrow night," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Contribute your share, or we will collect it." He turned and walked away, his two hounds following, leaving the ultimatum hanging in the air like the promise of a storm. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in strokes of angry orange and bruised purple. The hum of the Locust was louder now, a constant nerve-shredding thrum on the edge of hearing. It was the sound of a closing window, of time running out. Inside the cabin, the lantern was lit, casting long, dancing shadows. There was no panic. There was only work. Lynn moved with a calm, focused economy, every action deliberate and purposeful. This was not a fortress she was building, but a web of consequences. She handed Tom a small pail. "Every loose stone," she said, "the ones that turn under your foot, bring them." For an hour the boy scurried back and forth, collecting a pile of ankle-twisting rocks. She had him place them carefully in the tall grass along the most direct path from the town to her cabin, creating an invisible, treacherous field. Next, she took down the collection of empty tins she had saved, bean cans, biscuit tins, their metal sides dull in the lamplight. She worked with a length of scavenged wire, threading it through holes she had punched in the tins. Together, she and Tom strung the wire low to the ground between her porch post and the broken wagon wheel of her pulley rig. A simple, noisy tripwire that would turn a stealthy approach into a clumsy clatter. Her preparations were all grounded in the physics of the real world: gravity, noise, friction. She took a spare bucket and filled it with the sourest, most pungent slurry she could create: rotting vegetable matter, stagnant water, mud from the deepest part of her digging. She attached it to the pulley rope, hoisting it high into the air, a foul pendulum waiting to be swung. The final and most important defense was the Dixia itself. She and Tom descended one last time, carrying with them 2 heavy lengths of timber. From the inside, she showed him how to wedge them against the stone slab's underside and brace them against the solid earth walls of the tunnel entrance. Once in place, the stone could not be lifted. It would take a sledgehammer and hours of work to break through. It was a lock made of leverage and earth. As they worked, Tom's face was tight with the fear he was trying to master. "Will they come?" he whispered, his voice small in the vast, quiet cavern. Lynn paused, her hand resting on the cool, damp wall of her sanctuary. "Men like that," she said, not looking at him, "believe that what is hidden must belong to them. They believe loneliness is weakness. They are coming." She looked at the rows of green, thriving plants in the lantern light. They were an act of faith in a faithless world. "Tonight," she said, her voice softening for the first time, "we show them what a root can do when it holds tight to the ground." Night fell like a blanket of ash, swallowing the last light from the sky. The hum of the locusts grew into a palpable vibration, a sound you could feel in your chest, the world holding its breath before a scream. Lynn extinguished the lantern. She and Tom sat in the deep, absolute darkness of the cabin, listening. For an hour there was nothing but the insect drone and the frantic beat of the boy's heart, which she could almost hear beside her. Then a new sound, the crunch of a boot on dry soil, the low murmur of voices trying and failing to be whispers. They were here. A shadow blotted out the faint starlight in the window, a heavy thud against the door. "Lynn, we know you're in there." It was Abram's voice, thick with cheap courage from a bottle. "Corbett sent us for the town share." "Open up!" Silence was her only answer. Another thud, harder this time. The old wood groaned, a curse from outside, followed by a sharp yelp and a loud, metallic crash. One of them had found the tripwire. The cascade of rattling tins shattered the night's quiet. More cursing. They were clumsy, impatient. Their greed made them loud. The assault on the door began in earnest, the rhythmic slam of a heavy object against the frame. But Lynn had reinforced it, and the old wood held. "The hole!" another voice shouted. "Forget the door. Let's get what we came for." Footsteps scrambled towards the stone slab. Lynn could hear them grunting, their boots scraping as they tried to get a grip on the heavy stone. "It won't move," one of them yelled in frustration. This was the moment she had prepared for. She slipped out the cabin's back window, a small opening meant for ventilation, and crept around the side of the building. She was a shadow among shadows. She reached the pulley rig. With a single, fluid motion, she released the catch holding the rope. The bucket of filth plummeted downwards, not directly on them, but swinging in a wide, sickening arc. It hit the side of the rig with a wet, explosive splat, showering the men in a vile, stinking rain. They howled in disgust and surprise, stumbling back, slipping on the mud and stones. In the confusion, Abram, maddened with rage, made one last, desperate attempt to lift the stone. He wedged his fingers underneath, straining with all his might. The stone shifted just an inch, and then settled again with a sickening crunch. He screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony. His hand was pinned. The other men froze. The fight was gone from them, replaced by the sight of their leader, trapped and wailing. The night went silent again, except for Abram's ragged sobs. Lynn walked into the open, holding the now lit lantern. The golden light fell upon the scene of pathetic failure. The men, covered in filth. Abram, on his knees, his face a mask of pain and humiliation. She looked down at him, her expression unreadable. He stopped sobbing and stared up at her, his bravado gone, his eyes pleading. "Help me," he whispered. Lynn did not move. She waited until the silence stretched, until his shame was a tangible thing in the air between them. Then, and only then, did she nod to Tom, who emerged from the cabin with a long iron pry bar. The sun rose on a world transformed. During the deepest hours of the night the sound had changed. The high hum had become a deafening, clicking roar. The sky was no longer blue, but a roiling, living brown. The locusts had arrived. They descended not like rain, but like a shroud, covering everything. The communal fields that were already brown and withered were stripped to black soil in less than an hour. The leaves on the few struggling trees vanished. The world was being eaten alive. From inside the cabin, through a small crack in a boarded window, Lynn, Tom, and Martha watched the devastation. Martha had arrived just before dawn, drawn by the sounds of the aborted raid and a final shattering break with the town's madness. Her face was pale with terror and awe. The noise was immense, a physical pressure that made the cabin walls seem to tremble, but inside they were safe. The locusts swarmed over the heavy stone slab covering the Dixia, a crawling, clicking carpet of hunger, oblivious to the impossible garden thriving just a few feet below. They were a storm that could not touch the root. By midday it was over. The swarm lifted, a great dark cloud moving east, leaving behind a silent, barren landscape and a stunned, broken community. The consequences for the aggressors were quiet, but absolute. Abram, his hand crudely bandaged, was a man broken in spirit. His authority, built on bluster, had been crushed under a rock of his own greed. Corbett's power, built on the manipulation of fear, evaporated when a greater fear arrived, and he had no answer for it. He had promised to provide, to lead them through the crisis, and he had failed. The town's gaze shifted. When they looked toward the widow's cabin, They no longer saw a curse or a hoarder. They saw the only green thing their eyes had seen in weeks when she finally opened her sanctuary. It did not happen all at once. It began with Martha, who helped Lynn organize and ration the harvest. Then Tom, who became the garden's fiercest protector and student. Slowly, cautiously, other families came. Not with demands, but with offerings. A handful of nails, a length of rope, a promise of labor. They came to barter their shame for a chance to survive. Lynn did not preach or forgive. She simply put them to work. She taught them Way's story, not with words, but with actions. They dug new tunnels, expanding the hidden farm. They learned the discipline of the dark, the patience of the earth. The widow's folly became known as the root. It was the heart of a new redemption, one built not on false hope and envy, but on the hard-won lessons of the soil. One evening, months later, Lynn gave Tom a small, perfectly smooth, egg-shaped stone she had found deep in the earth. It was cool and solid in his hand. "The sky can be a liar," she said, echoing Way's words, "but the earth protects what you give it." He closed his hand around the stone, the first gift he had ever truly earned. It was not a keepsake of a hard season. It was the seed of a legend.